Today's video is going to have more of a serious tone. This story may be familiar to some of my Canadian viewers, but outside of that, this is probably going to be new to some of you guys. I've mentioned a few times here and there that I have post-secondary education in the criminal justice area. Even though I've never pursued a career in that field, a lot of that stuff still interests me. This story today itself is pretty gruesome, I'll be honest. I'm not trying to ride the shockwave value here though. What happened here actually brings to light a much larger issue, and that's how juvenile and broken the Canadian justice system can be. I'm actually going to do a few videos on this subject. So get ready, this video isn't going to be for the faint of heart. Today I'm going to tell you about Vince Lee, Canada's Greyhound killer. Vince Lee was born in China in 1968. Not a lot is known about his early life. We do know that he graduated from college with a bachelor's degree in computer science, and that he worked in Beijing as a computer software engineer. Lee and his wife eventually migrated to Canada in 2001. When they arrived here, Lee worked in Winnipeg at different minimum wage jobs, from fast food and customer service to labor. Even though Vince did have a bit of trouble with the language barrier, he was described as reliable, hardworking, and not showing really any signs of trouble. There was an undisclosed incident in 2004 involving the OPP. The only information released on it though indicated that Lee was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. Medication that he only took briefly, but he didn't have a violent past or reputation. In 2006, he relocated to Edmonton to look for better job opportunities after him and his wife split up. While he was in Edmonton, he continued to bounce between menial jobs and ended up working at a Walmart and delivering newspapers on the side. The transition wasn't easy for Lee, and in June 2008, he was fired from his Walmart job because he was arguing with other employees in the workplace. After that, he was planning on heading back to Winnipeg for another job interview. 4 weeks later, he would be involved in one of the most gruesome murders in Canada's history.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our top story this hour, new details emerging this afternoon about that brutal murder aboard a Greyhound bus in Manitoba yesterday. Police have laid charges in the crime that has shocked the nation. Our James McDonald is live now with more on this story. And James, what more have we learned today?
Through witness testimony, they were able to piece together Lee's last couple days. Let's go through the events. Edmonton, July 28th, 2008. At midnight on the 28th, Lee boarded the Greyhound bus to Edmonton, heading to Winnipeg. 6 p.m. the next day, there was a stop at Erickson, Manitoba, and Vince, in a completely random act, decided to get off the bus and wait for the next one. He would have to wait and continue his trip on the next bus that came by, bus 1170. In Lee's own words, he said that God told him to get off the bus and wait. While he was in the small town, witnesses reported that they seen Lee sitting on a bench next to a grocery store at 3 a.m., quietly staring into the distance all by himself. Lee sat there and waited all night by himself in the small township. The next time he was seen was in the early morning hours when he took out his laptop and put a small for sale sign on it for $600. It was later learned that he sold the laptop to a 15-year-old boy who was just passing by for $60. It's almost like Vince knew he wasn't going to need it anymore. On a different bus, a young man named Tim was on a similar travel path and destination as Lee. Tim left Edmonton on board a different Greyhound bus than Lee did. Bus 1170 headed to Winnipeg. Tim was a young man who traveled between Winnipeg and Edmonton for work. He was coming home from his job in Edmonton, where he worked for a seasonal carnival. He often traveled home in his free time to see his family and girlfriend who was pregnant. When Tim boarded the bus, he sat at the rear, one row ahead of the toilet. At 7 p.m. on July 30th, bus 1170 stopped in Erickson, Manitoba as part of their route to Winnipeg, and they ended up picking up a new passenger, and that passenger was Vince. When the other passengers were interviewed later on, they said there was nothing out of the ordinary about Vince, nothing alarming. He sat in the front very quietly and motionless for over an hour as the bus came closer to its destination. When the bus came to one of its last scheduled rest stops just outside of Winnipeg, Vince left the bus shortly to have a cigarette, and when he got back on the bus, instead of sitting in his front row seat, he moved toward the back of the bus. Carefully, he looked around at each passenger and seat before reaching the rear of the bus where Tim was sitting. Lee, ignoring all the empty seats, looked at Tim. Tim acknowledged and smiled. Tim even motioned to invite him to sit down beside him, thinking he was a harmless passenger just looking for a seat. Lee slowly sat down, and Tim leaned back against the window, closed his eyes, put his headphones on, and tried to relax. As the bus continued on its route, Lee's behavior started to change. The whole time he was sitting there quietly, and suddenly he started to fidget. And then he started to talk to himself in Chinese. Tim was completely unaware due to the fact he was listening to music with his eyes closed, possibly sleeping. Very quickly, Vince's behavior escalated. Without warning, he pulled out a knife from his side pocket and lunged it into Tim's neck. Tim tried to fight back, but he was completely caught off guard and overwhelmed. Vince, completely calm, continued to stab Tim over and over again while the terrified passengers screamed for the bus to stop. and flooded to the front door. As the people ran from the back, Tim tried to escape from Vince, and they both ended up falling into the aisle, where Vince continued his horrid assault. Moments later, the driver did an emergency stop on the side of the highway, and everyone fled the bus except for Lee. As horrible as this incident has been so far, it only gets worse. If you're faint of heart, be warned, the next part is a little gruesome. But as terrible as it all is, there's a much bigger point to this at the end. With that out of the way, we have to continue because Vince wasn't quite done yet. On the other side of the busy highway, the passengers outside of the bus watched as Vince continued to desecrate Tim's lifeless body. After several minutes of taunting the outside passengers, Vince inevitably removed Tim's head and carried it around the bus, pressing it against the windows for everyone to see. A tremendously traumatizing event for anyone involved. A passing trucker stopped to see what all the commotion was about, and when he realized the extent of the current circumstances, he gathered tools for others to use in case they needed to defend themselves. The truck driver actually momentarily got on the bus, but decided not to engage with Lee and instead barred the doors so he wasn't able to escape.
Everybody got off the bus. Me and a trucker that had stopped and the Greyhound driver ran up to the door to maybe see if the guy was still alive or we could help or something like that. And when we all got up, we seen that the guy was cutting off the guy's head. He was cutting off the guy's head there, and he saw us. He came back to the front of the bus, told the driver to shut the door. He pressed the button and the door shut, but it didn't shut in time, and the guy was able to get his knife out and take a swipe at us, so we backed off the door. And I ran around the backside of the bus driver took off, and then we both returned to the front to see what had happened, and he hadn't gotten off the bus. The door was still open. We shut the bus door that time and shut it. It was at that point that he came, started walking to the front of the bus, and he had the head in his hand, and he just looked at us like this and dropped it on the ground, like totally calm.
It wouldn't be till 9 p.m., 30 minutes after the start of the attack, that the police would finally arrive, and the scene they arrived to was undescribable. Lee was parading Tim's severed head up and down the aisles. Eventually he got bored, and he started to dissect Tim's body. He removed most of Tim's organs. He removed his heart, his lungs, his liver. Every piece of Tim's body was defiled and tossed around the bus. Vince then positioned himself in full view of all the terrified passengers and officers and ate one of Tim's eyes and part of his heart. Lee also had plastic bags with him, and he started to fill the bags with pieces of flesh. For what purpose? Who knows? When the officers arrived, they contained the scene and attempted to reason with Vince, who was still alone in the bus, but that was obviously useless. Lee continued to dissect Tim's body for hours while incoherently yelling out of the bus, while the RCMP thought the best course of action would just be to wait it out. So for hours, they just waited, did nothing but track his movements on the bus. I know what a lot of you guys are thinking right off the bat. Why even try to reason with this murderer? Why not just shoot him? I hear ya. We'll get to that in a minute. Over 4 hours, the RCMP tried to reason with Vince while he continued to mutilate Tim's body. 1:30 a.m., 5 hours after the reported attack, Vince attempted to escape the bus by breaking through the window. The RCMP immediately shot him with tasers and sent an attack dog after him, and he was apprehended and placed in the police cruiser. Parts of Tim's body were found in plastic bags on the bus, while other parts were found in Lee's pockets. Tim's eyes and part of his heart were never actually recovered, and they were presumed to have been eaten by Vince during the incident. Once the scene was secure, they took Vince to a secure hospital. See, this is where one of the main issues in this whole situation presents itself, and opinions are going to be split on this. I'm actually kind of split on this. See, in Canada, we have a rule in policing about the use of deadly force. It can only be used in situations where someone's life is in direct danger. So if Vince had a gun and was shooting, then the officers' lives would have been in direct danger, so they would have had full right to use deadly force. Since it was clear that when the officers arrived, Tim was already deceased and Lee himself was trapped on the bus, no one was in direct danger because, well, the damage had already been done. It's a really crazy situation when you think about it. Like, what do? Do you just shoot this obviously mentally ill man? Do you try to arrest him? I don't know what would be considered the right thing to do in this situation. See, because if you're an officer, you have to follow due process, and there's a fine line between using your own discretion and taking the law into your own hands. When I think about this incident, it's actually kind of pivotal to me. Not because of my connection with anyone or anything like that, it just reinforces the fact that I'm not necessarily policing material. In a moment like this, I don't know if I'd be able to remain calm and not take the law into my own hands. It's an extremely complicated situation because a police officer has to follow the due process and he can't be judge, jury, and executioner. The officer's job is to apprehend the criminals, prevent crime, and keep the public safe, not to decide the fate of a mentally ill schizophrenic. A lot of people give Americans shit for their lax gun laws, but it really makes me wonder if this situation would have unfolded differently if it took place in the States. Having strict gun laws can seem beneficial to the safety of the whole country, but at the cost of your own personal security. If this happened in the States, it might have went completely different if one of the passengers was carrying a handgun for protection. Maybe Tim could have been saved. Then again, maybe it could have just gotten worse. Who knows in the end? Those are just what ifs. And sadly, nothing can reverse the damage already done. It's a horribly complicated situation, and regardless of the outcome faced, nothing will be able to bring Tim back. And the only thing that can be done is to prevent this from happening again, and try to give the family and passengers affected some kind of justice and closure in this situation. The main reason I'm talking about this is because it bleeds into the next much more serious issue involved here, the Canadian justice system. One of the main problems was how fast Vince moved through the justice system. This is one of the first times in a while that Canada was getting an international spotlight for this, and it brought to everyone's attention the extremely complicated issue of long-term criminal responsibility for the mentally ill. And the reason why this is such an important issue, because as of February 2017, Vince Lee, the Greyhound bus killer, is a free man walking the streets in Manitoba. He was granted an absolute discharge. Take that in. There are no legal obligations or restrictions on this man. Nothing. They even helped him change his name. One of the most gruesome, horrendous murderers that Canada has ever seen is walking free. After he was apprehended, he was held for 8 months until his trial commenced in March. Vince ended up pleading not criminally responsible, and the psychiatrist said that Lee had a psychotic break. He said Lee performed the attack because God's voice told him Tim McLean was a force of evil and he was supposed to execute him. The preceding judge accepted the diagnosis and ruled that Lee was not criminally responsible for the killing, and with that he was sent to a mental health center for treatment. By 2011, they started to give him freedoms because he seemed to be improving and taking his medication under a controlled environment. 5 years later, he was deemed not a risk to the public and granted an absolute discharge. There are people in jail right now for marijuana possession that have had much more harsher punishments than Vince. I personally have a huge problem with how this whole incident went down. To me, the real important issue is not whether Lee was mentally responsible or aware of his actions, even though you can argue to some degree that there seems to be a bit of premeditation, like how he packed knives in plastic bags and how he wanted an officer to shoot him, similar to suicide by cop. Regardless, to me, the damage was already done. The biggest priority shouldn't have been whether or not Lee was sound of mind and how to treat his illness. The act was so violent and gruesome that the main priority should have been ensuring that everything can be done to possibly prevent this from happening again. And if that involves locking Lee up for the rest of his life, then that should have been done. Rehabilitation is an important aspect of the justice system, but it's not 100%. No amount of therapy or medication can guarantee that Vince won't snap again. We all know he's capable of horrible things. We know he has a mental illness. The mental illness is one that we don't fully understand. That in itself makes him a danger to himself and others, and they want to take the chance and put him back in public? To me, it's just not worth it. It's a stupid gamble, and the risk vastly outweighs the reward. Not to mention, it's a complete injustice for Tim and his family, along with the passengers.
He should be held responsible for it. He still did it. Whether he was in his right frame of mind or not, he still did the act. There was nobody else on that bus holding a knife.
What Lee did and what he's capable of doing makes him a danger to society, and we shouldn't take chances in situations like this. Rushing him through the social justice system and prioritizing rehabilitation over prevention was a huge mistake in the wrong direction. They didn't take the whole scope of the situation in. He was rushed through the system so fast that many things were overlooked and not thought out. From trial to his release years later, Tim's family and even the other passengers aboard the bus never had any input. They were never asked to testify. They were never included in the review and release process. They were basically forgotten about, which is wrong because even though Tim was the victim in all this, there was lasting effects on everyone involved. The truck driver and bus driver both had to quit their jobs because of PTSD. Another one of the witnesses was a young mom, and after the attack, she had a mental breakdown and lost her kid. Even some of the officers were affected. A year after the incident, one of the responding officers was found dead with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He suffered severe PTSD and anxiety after the event. I don't know what Tim would have wanted, but I think it's safe to say that the bare minimum that should have been done for him was to ensure that his child and family could find some kind of closure in this situation. And I don't see how that's even possible, knowing that Vince is walking free with zero repercussions. It's like they just took a ticking time bomb and put it back into society. The last thing I'm going to leave you guys with is something to think about. If Vince snaps and this does happen again, whose fault is it? The severely mentally ill murderer set free, or the failed court and rehabilitation system that let him out in the public? See you guys next upload.